Hey everyone, welcome back to the Ktor Server Fundamentals playlist. In the last video, we covered JWT authentication in Ktor. In this video, we will be implementing Google OAuth login. OAuth is an open standard for secure authorization which allows app to access user data securely without needing to see or store passwords. We can think of it as giving an app a temporary access instead of our actual login details. Google OAuth works on the same principle, allowing user to sign into third-party apps with our Google account. It's safe, fast, and super convenient. Plus, the app never gets access to our real password. In this video, we will first understand the overall Google OAuth login flow, how the authentication process works and why it's useful. Then we will generate the client ID and client secret needed for Google OAuth login. After that, we will integrate Google authentication into our application, allowing users to log in with their Google accounts. Next, we will set up the login and callbacks routes. And finally, we will reuse the JWT authentication we configured in the last video to issue a token so user can access protected routes without logging in again. Now, let's begin by understanding Google OAuth login flow. The process begins when clients make a login request to our server, and in response, our server redirects the clients to the Google login page. This redirection includes parameters like client ID and redirect URL. The user selects their Google account and grants the requested permission to proceed. Once the user approves, Google Authorization Server redirects back to our server callbacks URL along with the access token. With this access token, our server makes an authenticated request to Google's API to fetch the user profile information like email and name. Once we receive the user information, we store it in our database if it's a new user or update existing details if needed. And finally, we generate the JWT token containing the user ID and send it back to the client. This JWT allows the client to access protected resources without needing to log in again. Now, whenever the clients make a request to a protected endpoint, they simply need to include the JWT in request header for seamless authentication, and that's how OAuth login works. Now, let's begin by adding some dependency that we are going to need in this video. So, for that, we can move to the version catalog file within this Gradle package. And if you are following along with the previous authentication videos, then you might already have this Ktor server auth module. In case if you don't, then you can include this, as well as since in Google OAuth login, we will be making some API requests as well to the Google server. So for that, we will be needing the Ktor client as well. After that, we can move to the build Gradle file, and over here we can import this dependency. Also the Ktor server auth. We can simply sync the project. Now let's move to the plugins package and create a new Kotlin file, Google OAuth. Since we will be using both Google OAuth as well as JWT, but we can only install a plugin once. So instead of creating the application and installing the authentication within this Google OAuth, we can simply use something like the one used over here. Like if you notice, this JWT function is actually an extension function on authentication config. So for Google configuration as well, we will be creating a extension function on authentication config and invoke below the JWT. So for that, we can create something like function authentication config dot configure Google OAuth. Now we can call this function over here. So we can say configure Google OAuth. Since these both are extension function on authentication config, so we are able to call both of them. Also now we are only installing the authentication plugin once. So this solves the issue. Now over here we can configure the OAuth using the OAuth function, and we can pass the name Google OAuth. Within this we can configure our Google OAuth. So first we can specify the callback URL. So URL provider equals, we can specify the callback URL, which in our case is http localhost 8080 slash callback. So this is the URL that Google will redirect after the authorization with the access token. Now we can also pass the provider lookup. So details about the provider that we are going to use, in which in our case is Google. So we can say auth. So which in our case is Google. So we can say auth server settings dot auth to server settings. We can use this one, and within this we can specify the name. So name of the provider is Google, and authorize URL equals, we can simply say, and for authorize URL we are using this one. Now we can pass access token URL as well. So this is the URL for the access token. Now we can specify the request method. We can simply use, we will be using post request. For client ID, we will be getting client ID from our environment variable. So we can say system dot get environment variable, and we can specify Google client ID. And for client secret, we will be also referring to the environment variable. So we can say system get env, and we can specify Google client secret. So we will be generating these two value, and we will be adding that to our environment variable. Now we can also define some scopes. So we can say default scopes equals list of, and we can add this username dot profile and user info dot email, since we are interested in username as well as the email. So using this scope we will be able to access the username and email. And we can also pass some extra auth parameters using extra auth parameters, and we can say list of, and let's pass in access type to offline. So this way we can even pass the extra auth parameters. And finally we will also need to specify the client. So we can say client equals, and we can get http client as a parameter to this function, http client of type http client, and we can pass this to the client. So that should be it for the configuration. Now we will need to generate this Google client ID and Google client secret. So for that we can move to this http console.cloud.google.com, and within this we get to select the project, or we can also create the new one. So I will be selecting the project. You can, if you don't have any project, you can create the new one using this. So I will be using the existing project, and within this you can see this API and service section. We can click on this. We can click on this credentials, and we can click on create credentials and select the OAuth client ID. Now to use the Google OAuth, first we'll need to configure the consent screen. We can click on this. We'll set app name as Ktor fundamentals. You can select your email over here, then click on next. We can select this external and click on next, and we can pass the contact information. So and we can click on next. Then you can click on I agree and continue. Then we can create this. If you try to again create the credentials again, now we can click on credentials and we can select the OAuth client ID. And for the application type, we can select the web application. And for authorized JavaScript origin, we can specify HTTP localhost 8080. And for authorized redirect URI, we will be setting the slash callback path for the redirect URI. So you can add this over here. Then we can simply click on create. And you can see the client ID and client secret. Now I will copy this client ID. And to set the environment variable within this IntelliJ IDEA, you can click on this and edit configurations, and you can add the environment variable. So Google client ID equals, I'll paste the one that I copied. Now to add one more environment variable, we can use the semicolon and we can specify the next environment variable name. So it is Google client secret. We can copy the secret and we can simply paste it over here. So we added two environment variables. So to add two environment variable, we use the semicolon to separate between the environment variable. And to set each environment, we say the key that we are using to access the environment variable equals and the value. Now we can simply click on apply and OK. Now our environment variable has been set. Head over to the routing file to set up this callback and login routes. So we can get to the routing file. Now we can configure the login and callback URL. So for the login, we can remove this handling. Now for the OAuth login, we can simply use this authenticate and specify the name, which is Google OAuth. Now we can move this login to the authenticate block. So now whenever user hits this login route, then they will be redirected to the Google login page, since we are configuring the authorized URL as this. So the login route will be redirected to the Google login page. So we don't need any handling for the login. Now for the callback, we can create a GET request. We can specify the path as callback, since we have specified the URL provider, which is redirect URL, as slash callback. So now within this callback, we will be getting the access token. So for that, we can create a val principal and the type will be auth access token response dot, we can say auth 2. This can be null, so we can say equals call dot principal. So we got the access to the principal. Now we can add a check if principal equals null. In that case, we can simply respond with the text auth failed. And for status, we can specify the unauthorized. And we can simply return. So in case this principal is not null, we can get the access token, like we can say access token equals principal dot access token. Now using this access token, we can get access to the user information. So for that, we can get back to this Google OAuth file and let's create a suspend function. Let's say fetch Google user info. So using this function, we'll be passing the HTTP client and access token access token of type string, and we will be returning the user info. So we can create a user info, let's say at serializable, and we can say data class user info. So we can, on one end we can set the user id as a string whose value will be default to uuid dot random uuid dot to string. Now we will be having one property for name and one for email. So from this function we will be returning the user info. Now we will create one more data class to represent the Google user response. So this is the response that we will be getting from the Google's API. So we don't need this user ID since we are interested in name and the email. So we just have these two properties within this data class, but you can check for other values as well. Now we can make the API calls to the Google server. So we can say something like response of type HTTP response equals HTTP client dot get, and we can pass this URL. Now within this we can add the headers, the access token. So we can say headers append, and for name we can use HTTP headers dot authorization, and for the value we can use bearer and pass the access token. So we set the header, we set the URL. Now if response dot status equals http status code dot ok. Now within this we can access the user using val Google user equals response dot body, and for type we can specify Google user response that we had created over here. Since we return the type user info, we can also mark this nullable, since in case of failure we might need to return null. So now we can create user info and pass name equals Google user dot name, and for email Google user dot email. Else we can say null. Now we can add a return over here. So we will return this in case of success, else we'll return null. So now we can use this function within the routing. So we can say val user info equals fetch Google user info and specify the HTTP client. So we can get HTTP client as a parameter to this function. So we can say HTTP client of type HTTP client, and we can pass the HTTP client equals HTTP client and access token equals access token. Now we access the user info using this fetch Google user info and pass the access token. Now we can store this user info in our DB for now, which is this map. So instead of string to string, we can say string to user info. For now, we can get rid of this routes. Now we can store our user info within this map using users DB, and for key we can specify user info dot user ID. First we will also need to add a check. So if user info is not equal to null, in that case we can store this user info. For this user ID we will be storing this user info value. After this we can generate the token, JWT token, using the function that we had set up in the last video. So I won't be going through this again, since you can refer to the previous video for that. So within this function, we can pass the config and username. Instead of username, we can specify the username as user ID. So we can say user info dot user ID. So for username, we specified the user ID. And we can simply respond with this token. So we can say call dot respond, and we can map token to token. So in the else case, we can simply respond with internal server error. So we can simply say call dot respond http status code dot internal server error, since our Google authorization failed. So we can simply respond with this one. Now the overall flow is, first, when we call this login path, then it will automatically redirect to the Google page, since we are within this authenticate Google OAuth. And once user logs in, then Google server, after authorizing the user, they will make the redirection to the callback URL. Within this callback URL, we can get access to this access token using this principal. In case if principal is null, we are simply responding with OAuth failed response. And using this access token, we can get the user info. So we created one fetch Google user info function which takes this access token, and using this access token, it gets the user info. Now if user info is not null, we are simply adding this to our map. So currently it's map, but you can have your SQL or NoSQL database instance. So you can write to your DB, and after that you can generate the token, JWT token, and pass in the claim as user ID. And finally, you can respond with the map of token. If user info is null, then we simply responded with internal server error. So that is the part for Google OAuth. Now, within this GET request, let's respond with the user info. So for that, we can get the user info as val user info equals, and we can query our database usersdb and pass the username. In case it's null, we can simply respond with the error to true. Now, instead of respond text, we can respond this user info. So that should be it for the routing part. We can make some changes to our application module function. So for that, we can move to this application file, and over here, as you can see, this configure routing also requires the HTTP client. So let's create one. Let's say val HTTP client equals HTTP client and pass CIO and import this. Okay, we are not able to import this. We can check the dependency if we included the CIO. Okay, we have this. Now within this version catalog file for CIO, okay, we instead of core we need to say CIO. Now if we sync the project, now we should be able to import this CIO engine. Now within this we need to install the content negotiation, since while making the request we are serializing and deserializing the JSON object. So now we can say JSON, and we can also add some configuration. So we can say JSON and ignore unknown key equals true, since over here we are just getting the name and email, but within this Google user response, there are lots of other data as well. So we can ignore others. So for that, we can say ignore unknown key equals true. Now to resolve this error, we can change this server to client, since we are dealing with HTTP client. So for that, we'll need to import content negotiation from the client's package. Now we can simply pass the HTTP client over here. Now that should fix this. Okay. Now over here as well, within this JWT authentication, we'll need to get the HTTP client. So we can say HTTP client of type HTTP client, and we can pass the HTTP client over here. Now we are calling this from application. We will need to pass the HTTP client in the same way. Now let's run our application and try it out. For Google login, let's move to our browser so that we can see the Google login page. Now we can make request to http localhost 8080/login. So this will automatically redirect to the Google login page. So now once we hit, we get to see the our app name that we configured, which was Ktor fundamentals. Now we can choose the Google account and we can accept this and say continue. And as you can notice, we get the token. So using this token, we can access the profile. So now we can go to Postman. Now within this, we can go to the authorization. We can select barrier authentication and pass the token. So once we enter, we get user ID, name as well as email. So our Google OAuth is working as expected. So that's it for this video. In the next one, we will cover WebSockets in Ktor. Until then, thanks for watching and happy coding.